I'd like to welcome our very first guest to discuss a very familiar topic, which is the evolving expectations of candidates. I'm joined by entrepreneur, best-selling author, and generational expert, David Stillman. David, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So I want to take a second to first understand, how did you become the generational expert?
So I had a degree in journalism and I was working at a major network, and one of the producers said to me, hey, we want you to do a story on Gen X. Do you know those kids that just complain about bad hair and wine all day? And being a Gen Xer who had been putting in 80-hour weeks, I was like, that doesn't seem so correct. And it really started a journey into understanding not just a generation, but what happens when you put them together in the workplace or the marketplace.
Wonderful. So if any of our viewers are like me, it's hard to remember what are the different generations, what years did they grow up in the break points. So do us all a favor and help us understand what are the breakdown of the different generational years.
Absolutely. So right now we've got 5 living and working generations, starting with the amazing traditionalist generation, born before 1946. Then came the great big baby boom generation, 80 million strong, born between 1946 and 1964. Then a dramatically smaller generation, my generation, Generation X, between 1965 and 79. Then came the most talked about generation ever, the millennials, children of the baby boomers, 1980 to 94. And then my generation, Gen Xers, we had kids, Generation Z, born between 1995 and 2012. Now, I did just break it down for you here by birth years, and it's a wonderful starting place, but what everyone in staffing and recruiting really needs to know is if you're gonna understand these candidates, you gotta go beyond birth years. Because what really makes up a generation isn't the year they were born, but it's the events and conditions that take place during their formative years, so during adolescence. And because they experience these events and conditions, they then adopt a very own and unique personality that they take with them to every single life stage. So we don't become more alike as we get older, we become more entrenched in these generational personalities.
So help me understand, what are some of the conditions and events that have shaped the different generations, and specifically Gen Z?
Well, so Gen Z, the newest generation, one big one would be the economy. So if you compare that to the millennials, which we talk so much about, the millennials, their formative years had great economic prosperity, a business that started in a garage overnight becoming an empire. They had boomer parents telling them they could be anything they wanted to be. When you compare that to Gen Z, a lot different. It was the recession. It was times are really tough. The net worth of Gen Z's parents, Gen Xers, fell by 45% during the recession. So we weren't telling our kids you could be anything we wanted to be. We were telling our kids it's a tough world out there. And so as a result, they have a different personality than, say, the millennials.
I feel like we've talked so much about the millennials, we've almost forgotten that we have this whole population and this new workforce that's, between our walls every single day.
You are bringing up probably I think the key thing that's impacting most staffing and recruiting right now, and that everyone, and so many leaders as we travel the world will say to us, oh, those kids, and they'll just refer to everyone under 30 as the same, that they're all millennials. But Gen Z is radically different than millennials, and that's, I think, why the conversation went so well at Talent Connect, is that a lot of these leaders are like, oh my God, there's a whole new generation, they're already 25, and we don't know them very well.
Wow. So I want to get to know more about them in a second, but I want to make sure that our viewers know that you can ask questions that we're going to be fielding live during the show. So please feel free to submit those in the question box, and I'm going to share them with David. But David, what I want to understand in particular is, in your research, you've outlined some very specific traits that are reflective of Gen Z and that are important as we think about recruiting and retaining this population of people. So I'm curious to hear a little bit more about what those traits are and what you think recruiting leaders should take into consideration when working with them.
That's great. So one of the traits that we identified was that it's a very realistic generation. And again, it's events and conditions that result in a trait. So how did we get a realistic generation? Well, I mentioned the economy. When you grow up seeing, your parents' net worth fall, everything on TV crumble, you have a little bit more of a realistic attitude. On top of it, Gen Z was parented by Xers, and we were just a little bit more pragmatic, straight to the point with our kids, less idealistic. And so as a result, this generation really is looking at the world through lenses that are just more realistic. So how does that play out for staffing and recruiting? Well, millennials, who are a little bit more idealistic, when we recruited them, it was much more about meaning. You come work here and I'm going to tell you how you're going to move the needle on something, how you're going to create passion, change the world. Very important to Gen Z, but in all of our surveys around Gen Z, the number one thing they're looking for was salary. So companies that used to sort of say, well, maybe I can't pay you as much, but look at, you're changing the world for millennials, that isn't working for Gen Z. So if you're recruiting Gen Z, top of their list is going to be money and salary because they're in that survival mode.
So I think being realistic
Yep.
and thinking about compensation certainly go hand in hand. But a lot of time recruiters sort of wait till the end of a process to talk about compensation, or you don't see it publicly displayed on websites or job descriptions or otherwise. Any tips that you've seen of companies that are having the compensation conversation correctly, because it can be a little bit tough with candidates?
Well, I think they're putting it right up front, because if you're a Gen Z and that's number one, all this other noise that you talk about is going to feel like noise versus get me my answer first. So talking about salary, how you're going to be able to reach a certain point, the timelines, have that conversation right up front so they can put that aside and then be, okay, that's a company I want to look at more. But the number one thing is pay and salary.
Excellent. So there are other traits that you've outlined. One of them is hyper customization.
Yes.
What does that mean for this group, and how can we think about it as recruiting professionals?
Sure, it's pretty cool. If you look at other generations, the goal growing up has always been to fit in. You want to be like everybody else and find your own place. Well, completely different goal for Gen Z. Their goal's always been to stand out. And they've been doing that since birth, building their own personal brands, whether it be through their posts, their pages, their hashtags. Everything's about, being unique. And so in the world of recruitment, no longer are you recruiting, hey, for this position, you're recruiting a person, and every job needs to be hyper customized. So I've seen companies allow employees to come up with their own job titles. Conversations around job descriptions or career paths are being done with the candidate versus here's how it goes and you step into it, versus here's a starting point. Let's talk and see if we can't hyper customize this job for you, since you are so used to everything else being hyper customized for you. It's not that they're needy or entitled. We have to be careful. It's just that they've grown up in this hyper customized world from elementary school on up. Why would it not continue into my career?
So there's another characteristic that is probably near and dear to my heart. And you talk about this generation being very driven, being very competitive.
Right.
How's that playing out in the workforce based on your research?
Well, it's so amazing because I talked about millennials being, all this meaning and passion. They also had baby boomer parents really open the door to communication. And so for millennials, it was all about collaboration. We saw open office space created, where it feels like a dormitory and we're all working in one big room. Well, Gen Z, remember, they had that survival mode. They also had Gen X parents that said, you know what, I don't like the way the boomers parented millennials. I don't believe in a participation award. I don't believe that if we all try our hardest, we could all be winners. And so we told our kids, look, there's winners and losers. It's a tough world out there, and you have to try hard. So if you look at this tough economy, parents are saying there's winners and losers. We now have a generation that is just so competitive. So, for example, I talked about millennials in open office space. Only 8% of Gen Z like open office space. They're more like, I don't want to collaborate with you. I want your job. And so oftentimes, a lot of companies or recruiters are really talking about these collaborative cultures, a family-friendly feel. And Gen Zers could look at that and be like, is this summer camp? So they're looking for the cultures that really talk about the best rise to the top. We'll recognize you individually, and we'll promote you accordingly, where millennials was like, oh, we're all getting raises today because so-and-so got a raise. So it's moving from this collaborative think to more competitive think tank, which is going to be more geared towards Gen Z.
See, that's incredibly interesting because for the first time ever, we have 5 generations working in the workforce together. And you just noted one key example about how 2 of them are fundamentally different in how they embrace a work environment. So how can companies think about creating environments or even recruitment experiences that speak to these generations or cut across these generations so that they can serve them each in the way that is best for them?
Well, the savvy ladies that I'm working with do not have a one-size-fits-all mentality, and they realize that each generational personality is unique. The real smart ones are not trying to figure out who's better, who's worse, right or wrong. They just accept that they're different. So knowing that each generation is different, in the recruiting space, if you're going after younger talent and it's Gen Z and you're going to, say, college campuses, you want to understand that's the mindset you need to be in. And too often, if you're an Xer trying to recruit a millennial or a Gen Z or a boomer doing it or vice versa, you have your own generational mindset on and not the others. So I would say targeting and really slicing it by generations allows you to do a much targeted and successful job for recruiters.
Thank you. So there's an interesting term that you guys trademarked called phygital.
Yes.
And I want to understand a little bit more about what that means and how it's impacting how we communicate with this generation.
So one of the 7 traits that we identified is phygital, and it's the other generations have spent a lot of time blurring the lines between physical and digital, whether we watch, brick and mortar go to e-commerce or starting to accept things like a video resume and things like that, where for Gen Zers, they've only known that world. So while the rest of us are blurring the lines between physical and digital, For Gen Z, they see no line at all. So something like a video resume or a video interview would just seem like, well, of course you do that. Where the other generations are slowly accepting it, there's a lot of progressive technological recruitment tools that Gen Zers are expecting. And in fact, 91% of Gen Z said technological sophistication would impact their desire to work at a company.
Wow.
It's not just enough to have the technology, you've got to be sophisticated with it. And that's what living in the digital world's about, where you see no lines between physical and digital.
So we're going to be having a panel just in a little while on this show, and we're going to be talking about just that. What are the technologies that we have at our disposal as recruiting professionals to be able to better connect with all generations, but specifically the ones that sort of demand it most? And I think there's a lot of complexity and confusion amongst our clients. So I know you work with a number of great organizations, 3M, Intuit, the NFL, certainly us at LinkedIn. I'm curious if you've seen in any of the clients or others that you've worked with in the past that are doing a really great job at this and being able to create the right experience for Gen Z, or to be able to retain them or attract them to their organization. Anything you can share that you're seeing working really well in the market today?
Well, sadly, the most important thing is to recognize that they're even a generation. I have most people just lumping them together, calling them millennials, referring to them as the younger, not even saying, hey, you're Gen Z. So it's recognizing that your own generation and that we want to get to know you. So that would be actually the first and most important thing. The other thing that I'm seeing is not enough organizations are training their millennials. They're going to be the frontline staff. And there's a lot of unfortunate millennial disdain out there right now. People are tired of talking about the millennials, dealing with the millennials, which is not fair to that generation. But even more so, I think we run the risk of companies not investing in their millennials as they move into that next stage of management. So I'll be at a lot of these leadership conferences, and the leaders will get it, but they haven't taken that message now and then brought it into the millennials, who really will be on the front lines of managing them. So I think it's time to talk about them and then training those that we're going to have to deal with them on a daily basis on how to work with them. Otherwise, Gen Zers will find other places to work.
Great. So we're going to take a few questions from our feed momentarily.
Okay.
But you mentioned leadership, which is an important part. And if I did the math right when we saw the birth years, I noticed some pretty sizable differences in just the volume of generations in the workforce. So I'm curious if you've seen or have any concerns about leadership gaps that might start to emerge.
That's a great one. In fact, a lot of people, what they do is it's all the attention on the younger generation. How am I recruiting them? Gen Zs, they're nothing like the millennials, David. What is it going to take to pull them into our industry, et cetera? But no one is having a conversation with me, which they should be, about what's happening at the executive ranks. You've got 80 million boomers and only 60 million Gen Xers. And baby boomers are sticking around longer, whether it be because of the economy and they have to, or they're healthy, they feel great, they want to keep working. And they're not retiring like we all thought everyone would in their 60s. And so we maybe aren't as aware of this issue, but as boomers move out of organizations, I think there's also going to be a huge dearth of employees amongst my generation who just numerically can't fill those 80 million spots. And so yes, get to know the younger generation, but make sure you're not keeping your eye off the ball of what's happening at the executive ranks, because if you're recruiting at that level, there's just not as many Gen Xers to step in to those boomer leadership positions.
Yeah, so this is really important because I think our search and staffing agencies are looking internally to understand how do they build and develop the next generation of leadership at their firms, but they're also looking externally as, of course, their customers are looking in different capacities to leverage their services to find candidates to fill that. So it's interesting that A, we might start to see gaps in the talent pool, and B, we need to be thinking internally about our leadership ranks and how we can actually develop that next generation to help ensure that we have successful organizations. So Thank you for sharing that. We have a lot of questions that are coming through from our feed right now. So I just want to jump into some of those straight on. So first and foremost, what are your thoughts on finding Gen Z candidates and actually getting in front of them? For example, are phone calls more important than text messaging? Are you finding there's more or less channels that connect with this group?
I think the thing about finding Gen Z is that people need to get on the radar earlier. Usually, we want to get this new generation of employees, so we go look typically for a junior in college, because that's around the age of an internship. They have that internship, we get to know them. Yet in our data, 67% of Gen Z are making career decisions before they even go to college.
Wow.
So by the time, if you're reaching out a junior year in college, that person probably has an industry, if not a career, if not even a company in mind. So what I would be doing is getting in front of high schoolers that are making these decisions about what careers they want and partnering at that level to get on the radar, especially industries that are big, like insurance, where Gen Z, there could be great careers there, but they just don't know about, all they think is I'm be doing is dialing for dollars all day long. Versus, wow, there's entrepreneurial, there's tech, you can do a lot of cool careers in an industry like that and many others, but just not on the radar. And by the time they do get on the radar, oftentimes it's too late.
So, very fascinating question that I see here. We know in many ways how the older generations see the next generation. How does Generation Z see those before them? So how do they see the boomers? How do they see the millennials? Like, how do they interpret the others around them at work?
Well, we've had a bit of a shift. For millennials, as I talked earlier about, the baby boomer parents really opened those lines of communication. So suddenly you saw kids calling parents or the parents' friends by their first name. And so they really sort of lower that hierarchy. And so we're all sort of friends. So millennials came into the workplace, they're treating those older than them like a friend, and people didn't really like that as much. Gen Z's had a little different schooling. They've been told, look, you will have to start at the bottom and you work your way up. That Gen X sort of, it's a tough world out there. And so Gen Z is very open to input. They've had a lot of mentors, a lot of counselors in schools, a lot of people weighing in, and they are very much aware that it cannot be out with the old, in with the new, because that only gets them in trouble, and it got the millennials in a lot of trouble. So I think they're saying, I want to climb here, but the way I'm going to have to do that is with the older generation. So we see amongst Gen Z a lot more curiosity and even a lot more dependence on them to move their own careers forward.
Very interesting, Thank you. So one thing that we know at LinkedIn is that diverse teams win, no doubt about it. And I'm kind of curious, how can organizations get the most out of Gen Z, and what are the value adds that they bring to organizations as recruiters think about finding them, sourcing them, and placing them within organizations?
Well, I think you just said it, in the opening statement, is that diverse teams win out. And too often, I will walk into a company like, we have this whole recruitment program targeted towards Gen Zers, and we'll sit down with that team, and I'll look around the room. Well, they're all boomers and Xers. I'm like, why would you ever have been able to design a website for Gen Z when you had no Gen Zers at the table? So the work that I see that goes really well is the ones that had all those generational voices at the table for sure.
So this was a clarifying question that came through. If you had to pick, based on your global research and what you know about Gen Z, do they care about culture or money more?
I'm going to say money.
Yeah.
And the reason I think that is I think they create culture in a host of ways. We have more remote workers. And so sometimes culture might just be the setup I create around home, online, on screen. So I think culture is less defined by four walls in an office, but your job still has a salary tied to it. So I think they're going to say salary first, and I'm going to help create culture.
There is a culture component that you mentioned to me that I want you to be able to share with our viewers, and that's the idea of embracing the side hustle with Gen Z. Talk to me about what that means and what companies should be thinking about.
Well, the idea of a side hustle isn't new. We've been doing it, we called it moonlighting, but we never talked about it. Sort of, I need a little extra cash, I did something on the side, I wasn't proud of it, but I did it. Well, Gen Zers, they have side hustles loud and proud, and they talk about it. But a few differences here. One is, if you and I had a business idea right now, within 48 hours, we could have a website, a name, file for an LLC, a phone number. I mean, boom, we're up and running. So the barrier to entry for Gen Z's really gotten easy to start a business. But the other thing that I see a big shift is, for my generation and in boomers, the whole debate is, do I go start a business or do I stay at my company? It was a big debate, and I'll go maybe take that leap and try a business. With Gen Z, they're not saying it's an either or, they say it's an and. I'm gonna go work at a company, but I'm also gonna have my side hustle. So I think that idea of it's easy to entry and that I'm not limited to just, in the evenings working on it, I'm gonna do it anytime, anywhere, has made it a lot more prevalent. Now for recruiters, what I would say is recruiters need to talk about that side hustle up front. Need to say, what's your side hustle? Not even if you have one, because I guarantee you most Gen Zers have a side hustle. I'd say, do you have a side hustle? And then talk about it, because non-competes need to be back on the table. I feel like they've been watered down and sort of not really paid much attention to. But if I work, at a food company and I make birdhouses on the side, who cares? But if I'm inventing a new food item, that's a problem. Yeah. And sometimes Gen Zers won't be aware of that. So recruiters need to talk about the side hustle, see if there's a competitive component, and then go one step further, which is really hard for companies is, are we okay if you're going to be working on a side hustle and working for us? And it's a tough one, but those that are embracing the side hustle are for sure winning the recruitment game with Gen Z.
Interesting. So are there any categories or verticals that you're seeing that are more magnetic for Gen Z? Meaning certain industries that they may gravitate towards, or certain industries that they may be looking against. Any insight there based on your research?
Yeah, it seems pretty obvious, but it's the ones that are on the radar. But again, it comes back to what I said to you earlier. We need to get on the radar earlier. So think of an average high schooler. They're aware of LinkedIn. They're aware of these big tech companies, but they might not be aware of, like I said, an insurance company, a law firm, manufacturing, because just not on the radar. So right now, the verticals that are winning are the ones that get in the radar the earliest, because 67% are deciding what career they want before they go to college.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank you. This is super interesting. It's been really, really valuable. I want to end with one parting thought, and I'd love for you to share kind of with our viewers, what is the number one trick or idea or piece of advice that you would give them to be able to better connect with this generation?
With Gen Z?
Yep.
Get to know them. Don't go by birth, and don't stereotype. Like, for example, most people would assume, if I'm going to get in touch with a Gen Zer, I should text them, Yet in our surveys, 84% of Gen Z said they prefer face-to-face communication.
Really?
So I think it's really easy to make easy stereotypes about the younger generations. We tend to do that. But first, acknowledge that they're there, and then say, tell me about a key event that shaped you. And whether it be the economy or politics, or a world war, whatever that is, it's going to be radically different than yours. And that's how you're going to understand how that played out. But really, just not assuming they're millennials, start talking to them is what I'd say. And don't assume you know them based on some pretty easy stereotypes.
Wonderful. Well, thank you again for joining us. Really appreciate it. And thank you for tuning in as well. Feel free to follow David Stillman on LinkedIn, and also check out his LinkedIn learning courses on managing and marketing to Gen Z if you want to get to know more about this topic.